Hello. So today for my Buddhism presentation project, I will be talking about Buddhism in China. And so I will start off by talking about the start of Buddhism in China. So Buddhism traveled along the Silk Road, and it really started when two monks, Anshiko and Lokaksema, who came from India, um, came and they translated some of these Indian text into Chinese. And so they start off with the Discourse on Mindful Breathing, Discourse on the Samadhi of Direct Encounter with the Buddhas of the Present, and portions of the Wisdom in 8,000 Line Sutra. So they did not translate great amounts of text or even very important sutras, but they definitely started the movement and interest of Buddhism in China. And they start off in the early center of Buddhism in Luoyang, which is just east of one of the major cities in China, Chang'an at the time. And so, actually, in China, it is widely believed in Buddhist myth, and many believe this is a myth, that Emperor Ming had a dream of a flying man with golden rays coming from his eyes, from his head. And so when he woke up, he asked the advisors who this man might be, and they told him that it was the Buddha, a man who had found the way. And so he sent people out to find teachings of this man to find him. And so the myth goes that he found two monks that brought him the Sutra of 42 sections. And later editions of the story also tell of them bringing a sacred Buddhist relic and also him building the first Buddhist temple in his city. Now, many people believe this to be true as they were added very later on than the original, but the Sutra of 42 sections is very important, especially with this combination of Buddhist Bud- Buddhist thought and Chinese thought, as at the time China came from a time, well, Buddhism came to China at a time when they had already very built up ideological systems and government. And so the Sutra of 42 sections actually mimics these two big Chinese ideological systems and philosophies, Confucianism and Taoism, as in many of the sections, most of the Sutra of 42 sections, many sections start with the Buddha said, compared to in many of the other sutras as I once heard. And this is a mimicry or copy of the Confucian writings of the Master said. And at the same time, the Dharma is referred to as the way, as in Taoism. And so, what really allowed Buddhism to really grow was Buddhism came at a time of massive upheaval and warfare, but also in the elites of China, many people weren't sure what the Confucian and Taoist beliefs had to do with their philosophical phil philosophical thinking, because in China they believed the supreme goal of philosophy was to improve government. And so the Han Dynasty fell and it followed Confucian ideals. And it led into very big arguments, even being and non-being before Buddhism even became popular, of how the world worked. And the overall consensus was something many Chinese scholars and people were unhappy with, as it showed a world that was immoral and unjust. But with Buddhism, the thought of karma and rebirth really brought in uh the sense that everything comes from something in the world, but also it has a purpose. And so another thing that will go in on is that sudden versus gradual was a very big debate in at this time. And this is even seen with as Chan Buddhism, as we'll be discussing later, even use this to discredit their not adversaries, but opponents in which Buddhism would be the more popular. And so at this time, it was the time of six dynasties in China. Half of China was ruled by non-native people, non-Chinese, and which was the north, and the southern half was ruled by native Chinese. And so there was lots of upheaval at this time, but Buddhism had spread as many people started doubting and questioning their place in the world. And so they both developed very differently. In the South, the Buddhists had a lot more power with the aristocrats, and so they never really had a problem as the aristocrats saw them as their own, and many times the Sangha could gain power and the ruling elite didn't see any problem with it. And twice a question was asked whether Buddha should pay deference to the emperor, and both times the answer was no. The main conflicts between the Sangha and the elite, the aristocratic elite at the time, was when a Buddhist monk had befriended um, a member of the court, and he invited him to come to leave the court, leave the Sangha and join the court. And when he refused, the Buddhist monk was whipped to death. And now this happened with his brother, but that was, while horrible and quite barbaric, was the worst um, conflict between the two at this time. But in the North, Buddhism developed in a very different way because Buddhism was seen as a foreign thing, and so many Buddhists had to rely on their foretelling and magical abilities, where they would join the court and ask for rain to come or predict the weather. And so they gained power there. But what was different about the South was that in the North, the Sangha was below the government, as the government had appointed a leader of the Sangha. And so monks did pay deference to the emperor as compared to the South, which actually had persisted all the way through to the 20th century. And this could be seen because the Sui and Tang dynasties, which the Sui really boosted Buddhism. It had it as main religion. It really boosted, but then it fell, and the Tang dynasty took it over afterwards. While the Tang would switch back and forth between supporting Buddhism or not, and when many emperors would give lavish gifts to the Sangha, the next emperor would brutally oppress it. And so this was a time of upheaval in the Sangha, but also flourishing. So Buddhism really started to take root in China while not really making it its own yet. People were still struggling with it. And this can be seen in Tiantai Buddhism, where many scholars tried to make sense of all these teachings they had been learning, and especially contradictory, as many of the translations were incomplete and many sutras were still missing from India. And so they tried to order ways, and they came to a conclusion that the Buddha had these multiple teachings for different people in their times of lives and different conflicts. And so Buddhism really flourished here. It did have hiccups, but overall, Buddhism grew until, of course, the very end of the Tang Dynasty, when there was mass oppression, then a rebellion where many monasteries were destroyed. Well, this is much later on. Uh, Many only Pure Land Buddhism and two forms of Chan Buddhism survived through it. But let's get into Chan Buddhism first. This is more important. So Chan Buddhism has started in China, and it is said to come from Bodhidharma, a Buddha who had learned of more meditation and ways, and he had said to travel to Western Japan, and he had meditated until finally someone came to him and cut off his arm and became the second patriarch of Chan Buddhism. So the main marks of Chan Buddhism are that it's more focused on meditation and less focused on scripture. And the main focus is more of a reaction of people stuck in their ways. And so they focus on sudden enlightenment. And so even Huineng, the basically second founder of Chan Buddhism, who really popularized and made it popular in China, had, when fighting for power for his Buddhism, had claimed his Buddhism was sudden and the other Buddhism from someone who claimed to be the sixth patriarch when Huineng was the rightful one was gradual, and eventually he did win out this ideological battle. But I put here a really good example of Chan's Buddhism of trying to shock the person. So the master um, follower dynamic in Chan Buddhism was very important. And so this is a monk asking his master, if a man has his head shaved, wears a monk's robe, and takes the shelter Buddha gives, why then should he not be recognized as one who's aware of Buddha? And then the master responds, it is not as good as to have something than to have nothing. Complete, like, very confusing. No idea what this means. The first time I read this, struggled to know. But the point is to shock people into a sense of enlightenment. This was a very popular belief, and many of this persisted all the way in Japan and Korea. So it was a very popular and strong belief in China, even persisting through, as I said earlier, uh, a rebellion and massive repression. And so another very popular, actually the most popular form of Buddhism in China was Pure Land Buddhism. And so really Pure Land Buddhism actually shifted. It started in India, but Pure Land Buddhism became ideologies shifted in China to say that people who sinned and basically anyone could get into this Pure Land just because of how much power and how much compassion Amitabha Buddha had for them. And so this Buddha was massively popular, especially it came out another time of massive upheaval. And again, people had actually believed they had entered to the last stage of decline of Earth. And so they thought the only way to reach enlightenment was Pure Land Buddhism, where they would reach another world where they would be able to achieve the Dharma and enlightenment. And so Omitofo, Omitofo, I put that down as it's very interesting to me as Pure Land Buddhism is so prevalent throughout China that even when it was being repressed and destroyed, many of the wives and children of powerful aristocrats would use this change of Amitabha Buddha to still chant it, and it's actually still used in older Chinese people to as a greeting. And so it's very interesting how Pure Land Buddhism had changed in China, but also persisted. And so finally, as Buddhism and government as in China, or China uses its philosophies and religious systems to really um, master its government. And so on the left, you can see actually a picture of a Buddhist enlightenment certificate given out by the Chinese. And also, which I didn't mention before this, but a very popular Chinese sutra came out talking about how kings should deal with Buddhism and how they should use Buddhism to control the people to maintain the Dharma and really just take control. And on the right, a very more recent example of Buddhism and government is Buddhism and its um, giving being used as China to kind of bolster relations with Sri Lanka and really put a foothold there. So Buddhism has been very prevalent in Chinese society for a while and actually became the most popular religion in a while, even being 26% of people in recent studies have lighted incense in support of the Buddha or bodhisattvas, and 30% of people in China believe in Buddhas or bodhisattvas. And so it is still a very prevalent religion, even in the mass repression it has faced since the Communist Revolution. But Buddhism is one of the most important religions in China today. And so this is where I'm going to end my presentation. Thank you for listening.